The ship's engines hummed quietly as Jake Morrison stared out the viewport at the green and brown planet below. Zarion Prime looked peaceful from space, but Jake knew better. Down there lived one of the galaxy's most feared predator species. "First time seeing a Kythera world?" Captain Lisa Hayes asked as she joined him at the window. Jake nodded. "I've studied them for years, but never thought I'd actually visit one of their planets." Lisa smiled. "Well, today's your lucky day. We're making history here, Jake. First human diplomatic mission to Zarion Prime." Jake had read every report about the Kythera. They stood 8 feet tall, had thick scales like armor and claws that could cut through metal. Most importantly, they protected their young with deadly force. No alien species had ever been allowed near. Kythera cubs and lived to tell about it. Dr. Morrison to the briefing room, came the announcement over the ship's speakers. The briefing room was full when Jake arrived. Captain Hayes stood at the front with a hologram of a Kythera warrior rotating slowly behind her. The creature looked terrifying even as a projection. "Listen up, everyone," Lisa began. "We're here to establish trade relations with the Kythera. They have rare minerals we need, and we have technology they want. But one wrong move and this mission ends badly." Ben Carter, the security chief, raised his hand. "What about their cubs?" "The reports say they go crazy if aliens get too close." "That's exactly right," Jake said, standing up. "Kythera cubs have never trusted any non-Kythera species. It's built into their DNA. Their parents will kill anything they see as a threat to their young." Amy Foster, the communications officer, looked nervous. "So we just stay away from any cubs we see?" "More than that," Jake explained. "Don't even look at them for too long. Don't make sudden movements. And absolutely never try to touch one." Captain Hayes nodded. "Jake's our expert on Kythera behavior. Follow his lead down there." An hour later, their shuttle broke through Zarion Prime's thick atmosphere. Jake pressed his face to the window as they flew over a vast forest. The trees were massive, some as wide as buildings. Strange flying creatures with rainbow wings darted between the branches. "There," Amy pointed ahead. "The settlement." The Kythera settlement looked like it had grown from the forest itself. Tall wooden buildings twisted around the giant trees, connected by bridges and walkways. Smoke rose from various points, and Jake could see movement in the shadows. Their shuttle landed in a clearing at the edge of the settlement. As the engines powered down, Jake felt his heart racing. He was about to meet the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. The shuttle door opened with a hiss. Hot, humid air rushed in, carrying the scent of flowers and something musky Jake couldn't identify. Captain Hayes stepped out first, followed by Ben, Amy, and finally Jake. A group of Kythera warriors waited for them. Jake had to tilt his head back to see their faces. They were even more impressive in person than in the reports. Their scales shifted from dark green to bronze in the sunlight. Their eyes were amber and seemed to glow with inner fire. The largest Kythera stepped forward. His scales were darker than the others, and scars covered his arms and chest. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rumbling. "I am Elder Zethkar. You are the humans who seek trade with our people." Captain Hayes bowed slightly. "I am Captain Lisa Hayes. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Elder Zethkar studied each of them carefully. His gaze lingered on Jake the longest. "You study our kind, human?" "I try to understand your culture and behavior," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Good. Understanding prevents mistakes. Mistakes with my people often end in death." The elder led them into the settlement. Jake was amazed by what he saw. Kythera children played in the lower branches of the trees, their parents watching carefully from nearby. The adults moved with fluid grace despite their size, and their claws clicked softly on the wooden walkways. But it was the cubs that caught Jake's attention. 3 small Kythera, each about the size of a large dog, peered at the humans from behind a thick tree trunk. Their scales were lighter than the adults, more silver than bronze. Their eyes were huge and filled with curiosity. "Don't stare," Jake whispered to Amy. But he found it hard to look away himself. The cubs were beautiful, with their oversized eyes and tiny claws. One of them, smaller than the others, tilted its head as it watched Jake walk by. Elder Zethkar noticed Jake's interest. "You see our young ones? They are curious about you, but they know to keep their distance." "They're magnificent," Jake said honestly. "They are our future. We protect them above all else." The elder's voice carried a clear warning. The group reached a large building in the center of the settlement. Inside, the walls were covered with carved pictures showing Kythera history. Jake saw images of great hunts, battles with other predators, and most importantly, adult Kythera defending their cubs. "We will talk of trade tomorrow," Elder Zethkar announced. "Tonight you rest in the guest quarters. But remember, humans, stay in your area. Do not wander, and do not approach our young." The guest quarters were simple but comfortable. 3 small buildings connected by covered walkways built high in the trees. As night fell, Jake sat on the wooden porch outside his room making notes about everything he'd seen. The forest came alive with sounds as darkness deepened. Strange calls echoed between the trees, and bioluminescent insects created moving patterns of light. Jake was so focused on his writing that he almost missed the soft scratching sound nearby. Looking up, he saw 3 pairs of glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. The cubs had followed them to the guest quarters. Jake froze. This was exactly what Elder Zethkar had warned against. But the cubs didn't seem afraid. If anything, they looked more curious than ever. The smallest one took a tiny step forward before one of its companions pulled it back. For several minutes, Jake and the cubs stared at each other across the darkness. Finally, the cubs disappeared back into the forest as silently as they had come. Jake sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. In all his research, he had never read about Kythera cubs approaching aliens willingly. Something was different here, and he had a feeling their mission was about to become much more complicated than anyone had planned. Jake woke to the sound of Amy calling his name. Sunlight streamed through the windows of his treehouse room, and birds with metallic feathers sang in the branches outside. "Jake, you need to see this," Amy said from the porch. He grabbed his clothes and stepped outside. Amy pointed to the ground below their quarters. Scattered around the base of the tree were small piles of colorful stones arranged in neat circles. Next to each pile sat a single flower with petals that seemed to glow in the morning light. "What is this?" Jake asked, though he had a growing suspicion. Ben appeared from his own room looking confused. "These weren't here last night. I checked the perimeter before bed." Jake climbed down the wooden ladder to examine the offerings more closely. The stones were smooth and warm to the touch, each one a different color. The flowers smelled sweet, like vanilla mixed with something sharper. "These are gifts," Jake said quietly. "Gifts from who?" Ben asked. Before Jake could answer, a rustling in the nearby bushes caught their attention. 3 small shapes moved between the leaves, watching them with bright eyes. "The cubs from last night had returned," Amy gasped. "They left these for us?" The smallest cub stepped partially out of the bushes. It looked directly at Jake and made a soft chirping sound, almost like a question. Then it quickly disappeared back into the foliage with its companions. "This is impossible," Ben muttered. "The reports say Kythera cubs fear all aliens." Jake gathered one of the stone circles carefully. Maybe the reports were wrong, or maybe these cubs are different. Heavy footsteps on the walkway above announced Elder Zethkar's arrival. The massive Kythera climbed down to join them, his amber eyes taking in the scene immediately. His expression darkened when he saw the gifts. "The young ones came here during the night," he said. "It wasn't a question, yes," Jake admitted. "They left these and watched us from the bushes." Elder Zethkar picked up one of the glowing flowers, turning it over in his large hands. "This is a friendship flower. Cubs give them to those they wish to know better." "Is that bad?" Amy asked nervously. "It is unprecedented," the elder replied. "In all our history, no cub has ever offered friendship to an alien species. They should fear you. Their instincts should tell them you are dangerous." Ben shifted uncomfortably. "Are we in trouble?" Elder Zethkar was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know. This behavior goes against everything we understand about our own young. Perhaps we should discuss this with the other elders." The morning's planned negotiations were postponed, while Elder Zethkar consulted with the settlement's leadership. Jake, Amy, and Ben waited in their quarters, unsure what to expect. "Maybe we should leave," Ben suggested. "This is clearly causing problems." "No," Jake said firmly. "This could be the most important discovery in interspecies relations. We need to understand why it's happening." Around midday, Elder Zethkar returned with 2 other Kythera. One was a female with silver-streaked scales who introduced herself as Senna. The other was a younger male named Torik. "Senna cares for the 3 cubs who visited you," Elder Zethkar explained. "Torik studies the behavior of our young. They wish to observe this unusual situation." Senna stepped forward. "The cubs are called Veltar, Kessela, and Jorek. Veltar is the smallest, the one who approached you most closely. She has always been bold, but this is beyond boldness. Can you tell us more about them?" Jake asked. Veltar and Kessler are siblings born in the same litter 6 months ago. Yorick is slightly older and acts as their protector. All three have shown unusual curiosity since birth, often exploring beyond safe boundaries. Torek nodded. We have been studying them because their behavior is so different from other cubs. They show less fear, more interest in new things, but even for them, approaching aliens should be impossible. What makes humans different? Senna asked. What is it about your species that allows this to happen? Jake thought carefully before answering. Humans form bonds with other species easily. We keep animals as companions. We care for creatures that aren't our own kind. Maybe the cubs can sense that we're not a threat. Impossible, Torek said. Cubs cannot override millions of years of evolution simply because you seem friendly. Then why did they bring us gifts? Amy asked. The question hung in the air without an answer. Elder Zethkar finally spoke. We will allow you to observe the cubs, but under strict conditions. You may not approach them. You may not try to communicate with them. And if there is any sign of danger to our young, you will leave immediately. Understood, Jake agreed quickly. That afternoon, Senna led them to a large clearing where the cubs often played. Jake sat on a fallen log about 50 feet away, while Amy and Ben positioned themselves nearby. Senna remained close, ready to intervene if needed. The three cubs appeared after about an hour. Veltar, the smallest, had scales that were almost white in the sunlight. Kessler was slightly larger, with green-tinged scales like their parents. Yorick was the biggest, with bronze coloring that marked him as nearly mature. At first, the cubs played among themselves, chasing each other around the clearing and wrestling in the soft grass. But gradually they began to move closer to the humans. Veltar was the bravest. She crept forward until she was only 20 feet away from Jake, then sat down and simply watched him. Her large eyes followed his every movement with intense curiosity. Kessler joined his sister, making soft chirping sounds that almost sounded like questions. Yorick remained further back, clearly torn between his own curiosity and his protective instincts. Jake remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The cubs were even more beautiful up close. Their scales shimmered with inner light, and their claws, though sharp, were still small and delicate. After an hour of this careful observation, Veltar did something that made everyone gasp. She picked up a small stick in her mouth and gently tossed it toward Jake. It landed about halfway between them. She wants to play. Amy whispered in amazement. Senna looked shocked. Cubs only play with family members. This should not be possible. Jake slowly reached for the stick, moving carefully so as not to startle anyone. When he picked it up, Veltar made an excited chirping sound and bounced on her hind legs. But before Jake could decide what to do next, Elder Zethkar's voice boomed across the clearing. Enough. The cubs returned to the nursery immediately. Senna quickly called the cubs back. They obeyed reluctantly, with Veltar looking over her shoulder at Jake as they disappeared into the forest. This changes everything, Elder Zethkar said grimly. Tomorrow we meet with the full Council of Elders. Your species may be more dangerous than we thought. Dangerous how? Jake asked. Any creature that can make our cubs forget their survival instincts is a threat to our future, the elder replied. We must decide if humans can be trusted with this power. As they walked back to their quarters, Jake couldn't stop thinking about Veltar's bright eyes and playful chirping. Whatever was happening between humans and these cubs, it was changing both species' understanding of what was possible. He just hoped it wouldn't end their mission before it truly began. The Council of Elders met at dawn in the Great Hall at the center of the settlement. Jake sat nervously beside Captain Hayes as 7 massive Cathera discussed their fate in their native language. The sounds were all growls and clicks that Jake couldn't understand, but the tone seemed heated. Elder Zethkar finally turned to the humans. The Council has reached a decision. We will allow you to continue studying the cubs' behavior, but with new rules. Jake felt relief wash over him. What kind of rules? You will observe them daily for 1 week. If the cubs show any signs of distress or fear, the study ends immediately. If they become too attached and refuse to return to normal behavior with their own kind, the study ends. And if we see any evidence that humans might harm our young, you will be banned from our world forever. That's fair, Jake agreed quickly. Elder Sathra, an ancient female with silver scales, leaned forward. Tell us, human, Why do your people bond with creatures not of your species? Jake thought carefully before answering. It's just part of who we are. Humans have always shared our lives with other animals. We keep them as companions, protect them, care for their young when they can't. We even adopt baby animals whose parents have died. The elders exchanged glances. Elder Mortek, a scarred warrior, spoke up. This is impossible. Predators do not care for the young of other species. Humans do, Amy said. Jake has a pet cat at home. He found her as a kitten and raised her himself. A cat? Senna asked. What is this creature? A small predator, Jake explained. About this big. He held his hands apart to show the size. Cats hunt small animals, but they also bond with humans. She sleeps on my bed and follows me around my house. The elders talked among themselves again. Finally, Elder Zethkar nodded. Begin your study, but remember our conditions. The next morning, Jake established a routine. He would sit in the same spot in the clearing at the same time each day, allowing the cubs to approach at their own pace. Amy positioned herself nearby with recording equipment, while Ben kept watch from a distance. On the first day, the cubs stayed about 30 feet away. Veltar was still the bravest, creeping closer than her siblings but not quite approaching. They watched Jake with enormous curiosity, occasionally chirping to each other in soft voices. On the second day, they moved to 20 feet away. Yorick found the courage to toss another stick toward Jake, though he immediately backed away afterward. Jake carefully tossed it back, and all three cubs seemed delighted by this simple game. The breakthrough came on the third day. Jake was sitting quietly writing notes when he heard a soft scratching sound nearby. Looking up, he saw Veltar only 10 feet away, digging in the soft earth with her small claws. She had found something buried there, a small metal object that looked like a toy. It was clearly artificial, probably dropped by another alien visitor years ago. Veltar held it up proudly, showing it to Jake, but as she stepped backward to rejoin her siblings, her hind foot caught on a root. She tumbled backward into a shallow ravine that ran along one side of the clearing. It wasn't deep, but the sides were steep and covered with slippery moss. Veltar chirped in distress as she tried to climb out. Her claws couldn't find purchase on the wet moss, and she slid back down each time she tried to escape. Jake looked toward Senna, who was frozen with panic. Her protective instincts were screaming at her to rescue Veltar, but the ravine was too narrow for an adult Kithra to enter safely. Without thinking, Jake jumped up and ran toward the ravine. Behind him, he heard Senna shout a warning and Ben call his name, but he was already sliding down into the narrow space. Veltar looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She was unhurt, but clearly scared and unable to get out on her own. Jake crouched down beside her. It's okay, little one, he said softly. I'm going to help you. Moving slowly, Jake scooped Veltar up in his arms. She was heavier than he expected, and her scales felt warm and smooth. She didn't struggle or try to scratch him. Instead, she made a soft purring sound and pressed against his chest. Jake carefully lifted her up to where Kessela and Jorek waited at the edge of the ravine. They immediately began grooming their sister, checking to make sure she was unharmed. Climbing out of the ravine took more effort, but Ben helped pull Jake up while Amy and Senna watched in amazement. Are you hurt? Senna asked, examining Veltar carefully. The little cub seemed perfectly fine. In fact, she appeared more interested in Jake than in her own rescue. She kept looking back at him and making happy chirping sounds. What just happened? Amy asked. Jake saved her, Ben said, still catching his breath. She would have been stuck down there for hours. Senna stared at Jake with something like wonder. You risked yourself for a cub that is not your species. This is what you meant about human behavior. Over the following days, everything changed. The cubs began approaching Jake with confidence, bringing him gifts of pretty stones and interesting leaves they found in the forest. They shared their toys, carved wooden figures of various animals that Kithera cubs used for play. Most remarkably, they began grooming him. Veltar would carefully use her tiny claws to untangle knots in his hair, while Kessela would clean imaginary dirt from his hands. Yorick, still more cautious, would inspect Jake's clothes and equipment with scientific thoroughness. Amy documented everything, amazed by behaviors that had never been recorded in any species. They're treating you like family, she observed. It's more than that, Senna said, watching the cubs play around Jake's feet. They have accepted him as a caretaker. In our society, only parents and close relatives are allowed to groom cubs or be groomed by them. The adult Cathara began treating Jake differently too. Where once they had watched him with suspicion, now they showed something closer to respect. Word of his rescue of Veltar had spread throughout the settlement. Elder Zethkar visited the observation site on the 5th day. He watched silently as Veltar curled up next to Jake for an afternoon nap, her small body rising and falling with peaceful breathing. In all our history, the elder said quietly, cubs have never shown such trust to any creature outside our species. Your actions have proven that humans are unlike any predator we have encountered. Jake gently stroked Veltar's scaled head as she slept. We don't see other species as competition or threats. We see them as potential friends. This changes much, Elder Zethkar admitted. If cubs can trust humans, perhaps adults can as well. Your Captain Hayes will be pleased to know that trade negotiations can proceed with new possibilities. That evening, as Jake sat in his quarters writing his daily report, all 3 cubs appeared on his porch. They had never ventured this close to the human buildings before. Veltar approached first, carrying a small object in her mouth. She dropped it at Jake's feet and sat back expectantly. It was a pendant carved from local crystal, hung on a cord made of woven plant fibers. It's beautiful, Jake said, picking up the pendant. Did you make this? Veltar chirped happily and pointed toward the forest where the other cubs waited. They had all contributed to making the gift, their first collaborative effort to create something for their human friend. As Jake fastened the pendant around his neck, he realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. These cubs weren't just overcoming their fear. They were actively choosing to trust and befriend a member of another species. The bond forming between human and Kithara was deeper than anyone had imagined possible. And Jake suspected they were only at the beginning of understanding what this relationship might become. Jake woke up feeling terrible. His head pounded, his throat burned, and every breath felt like fire in his lungs. The local virus that Amy had warned them about had finally caught up with him. He tried to get out of bed but immediately felt dizzy. The room spun around him as he collapsed back onto the wooden frame. Through his small window, he could see that the sun was already high in the sky. He had slept much later than usual. Amy, he called weakly, but his voice barely carried beyond his room. Within minutes, Amy appeared at his door with her medical scanner. I heard you calling. Oh no, Jake, you look awful. The scanner beeped as Amy ran it over his body. High fever, respiratory distress, elevated heart rate. It's definitely the Xerion flu. I've been expecting this. Ben arrived moments later, attracted by the commotion. How bad is it? Bad enough that we should get him back to the ship for proper treatment, Amy said, checking Jake's temperature again. This virus can be dangerous for humans. No, Jake managed to say between coughing fits. The cubs. They'll think I abandoned them. Jake, you're seriously ill, Amy insisted. The cubs will understand. But before they could make any decisions, soft scratching sounds came from outside Jake's window. 3 familiar shapes appeared on the wooden platform that served as his porch. Veltar pressed her face against the glass, her large eyes wide with concern. Behind her, Kessela and Jorek made worried chirping sounds. Somehow they had sensed that something was wrong with their human friend. Let them in, Jake whispered. That's not a good idea, Ben said. You're contagious. Kithara don't catch human viruses, Amy said after checking her scanner. Their biology is too different. It should be safe. Ben reluctantly opened the window. The 3 cubs immediately rushed inside, their small claws clicking on the wooden floor. They surrounded Jake's bed, making distressed sounds as they saw how sick he was. Veltar carefully climbed onto the bed and pressed her nose against Jake's forehead. She pulled back immediately, chirping in alarm at his high temperature. The cubs looked at each other, then began a behavior Amy had never seen before. Working together, they started gathering soft materials from around the room. Kessela brought Jake's extra blankets while Jorek collected pillows from the other furniture. Veltar disappeared outside and returned with armfuls of soft moss and sweet-smelling leaves. What are they doing? Ben asked. I think they're making a nest, Amy said in amazement. It's a caretaking behavior. They're trying to help him. The cubs arranged everything carefully around Jake's bed, creating a soft, comfortable environment. Then Veltar did something that made Amy gasp. She curled up directly against Jake's side, purring softly. That's impossible, Amy breathed. Kithara cubs only do that with their parents. Kessela and Jorek joined their sister. positioning themselves on either side of Jake so their warm bodies could help regulate his temperature. Their natural body heat was perfect for fighting off his fever-induced chills. Over the next few hours, the cubs never left Jake's side. They took turns keeping watch while he slept, brought him water in small containers they somehow found, and continued their gentle purring, which seemed to help him breathe easier. Amy monitored Jake's condition throughout the day. "This is remarkable," she told Ben. "His recovery rate is much faster than normal. The cub's body heat is helping regulate his temperature, and their purring creates vibrations that are actually helping clear his lungs." Senna arrived that evening. Drawn by reports of the cubs' unusual behavior, she found all three of them still curled around Jake, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time since becoming ill. "They have not left him all day?" she asked Amy. "Not once. They've been caring for him like he's their own family." Senna sat down heavily in a nearby chair. "This behavior is unprecedented. Kythera cubs care for sick parents or siblings, but never for other species. They are showing him the deepest form of trust our kind knows." "What do you mean?" Ben asked. "When a Kythera is vulnerable, they are most dangerous. Illness makes us unpredictable, sometimes violent. For cubs to remain close to a sick creature shows they have no fear of him whatsoever. They trust him completely." That night, Jake's fever peaked. He tossed and turned, sometimes calling out in his delirium. But every time he seemed distressed, Veltar would press closer against him, her purring growing stronger. The sound seemed to calm him, bringing his fever down each time it spiked too high. Amy watched in fascination as the smallest cub positioned herself directly on Jake's chest, her weight apparently helping him breathe more easily. "She's acting like a living, breathing treatment," Amy observed. "More than that," Senna said softly. "Veltar is sharing her life energy with him. In our culture, this is the most sacred bond possible. She is literally keeping him alive with her presence." Elder Zethkar arrived near midnight, called by the reports of what was happening. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the three cubs tend to their human friend. "How long have they been like this?" he asked. 14 hours, Amy replied. "They haven't eaten or played or done anything except care for Jake." "This changes everything," the elder said quietly. "What we are witnessing has never happened in our recorded history. These cubs have formed a family bond with a human. Is that good or bad?" Ben asked nervously. Elder Zethkar considered the question carefully. "It is unprecedented. Family bonds are sacred to our people. They cannot be broken once formed. These cubs now consider the human Jake to be their relative." By morning, Jake's fever had broken. He woke feeling weak but much better, only to find Veltar still sleeping peacefully on his chest. Her steady breathing and gentle purring had apparently continued all night. Kessela and Jorek noticed him stirring and immediately began making happy chirping sounds. They nuzzled against him affectionately, clearly relieved that he was recovering. "How do you feel?" Amy asked, running her scanner over him again. "Much better. Like I've been sick for weeks instead of just a day." Jake gently stroked Veltar's scales as she continued to sleep. "They stayed with me the whole time." "Never left your side," Ben confirmed. "They've been taking care of you like you're their parent." Veltar finally woke up, blinking her large eyes as she looked up at Jake. She made a soft questioning chirp, as if asking how he felt. When Jake smiled and whispered that he was better, she purred loudly and settled back down on his chest. "She's not planning to move anytime soon," Jake observed with amusement. Senna smiled. "Veltar has claimed her place. In our culture, once a cub chooses their sleeping spot with a family member, they keep it for life." "You mean she's going to sleep on my chest every night now?" "If you allow it," Senna said. "But understand what this means. You are no longer just a friend to these cubs. You are family, and family bonds among our people are permanent." Jake looked down at the small warm weight on his chest and felt something shift in his own heart. These cubs had risked everything to care for him when he was vulnerable. They had shown him a trust deeper than anything he had ever experienced. "I understand," he said softly. "And I accept." Elder Zethkar nodded approvingly. "Then we must begin planning for a new future, one where humans and Kythera are not just allies but family." Outside the window, the sounds of the forest continued as they had for millions of years. But inside the small treehouse, 3 cubs and 1 human had just changed the course of galactic history, with nothing more than love, trust, and the simple act of sleeping together in safety. 3 days after Jake's recovery, Elder Zethkar called for a settlement-wide gathering. The entire Kythera community assembled in the Great Clearing, where their most important ceremonies took place. Jake stood nervously beside Captain Hayes while Veltar, Kessela, and Jorek sat at his feet, unwilling to leave his side even for such a formal event. "My people," Elder Zethkar began, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. "We have witnessed something that changes our understanding of the galaxy. These humans have shown us that not all predator species are alike." Murmurs rippled through the assembled Kythera. Many of them had heard stories about the cubs' behavior, but seeing the three young ones sitting calmly with Jake made it real for everyone. Elder Sathra, the ancient female, stepped forward. "For generations we believed that our cubs could never trust outsiders. This belief has kept us isolated from other species, but these three have proven our assumptions wrong. How is this possible?" called out a voice from the crowd. Jake found himself pushed gently forward by Elder Zethkar. The massive Kythera nodded encouragingly. "Tell them what makes humans different." Taking a deep breath, Jake addressed the crowd. "We don't see other species as enemies or competition. Throughout our history, humans have formed bonds with creatures very different from ourselves. We keep animals as companions, protect species that can't protect themselves, and even adopt young creatures whose parents can't care for them. But you are predators," another Kythera called out. "Predators do not behave this way." "Human predators do," Amy said, stepping up beside Jake. "We've learned that survival is easier when we cooperate instead of compete. We're stronger together than apart." Veltar seemed to sense the importance of the moment. She stood up and walked over to Jake, gently headbutting his leg in a display of affection that every Kythera could see. The crowd went silent. Elder Zethkar nodded approvingly. "Veltar speaks without words. She has chosen her family, and her choice includes this human." "What does this mean for our people?" asked Mortek, the scarred warrior. "It means we must reconsider everything we thought we knew about interspecies relations," Elder Zethkar replied. "If our cubs can form family bonds with humans, perhaps we adults can form alliances." Over the next hour, the elders explained their decision. The Kythera would not only proceed with trade negotiations, but would also establish a permanent research program to study human Kythera bonding. They wanted to understand if this phenomenon could be replicated with other cubs and other humans. Captain Hayes stepped forward when asked to respond. "On behalf of humanity, I accept this honor, but I think the real credit belongs to Jake and the cubs who showed us all what's possible." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in Kythera history. Elder Zethkar presented Jake with a crystal pendant, carved with the symbol of the Kythera family unit. As he placed it around Jake's neck, the elder spoke in the ancient tongue. "What did he say?" Jake asked Senna quietly. "He named you Cub Friend, the first non-Kythera to receive such a title. It means you are considered family by our entire settlement." The three cubs seemed to understand the significance of the moment. They each brought Jake small gifts they had crafted themselves. Veltar presented a tiny carving of a human and Kythera sitting together. Kessela offered a necklace made of the friendship flowers they had first brought him. Jorek, always practical, gave him a small tool carved from hard wood. "These are beautiful," Jake said, accepting each gift carefully. "Thank you." The formal ceremony ended with a feast that lasted until well after dark. Kythera and humans sat together, sharing food and stories. Ben found himself in deep conversation with several Kythera warriors about hunting techniques. Amy discussed communication methods with the settlement's knowledge keepers, but the most significant conversations happened between Jake and the cubs. They had developed their own simple communication system of chirps, gestures, and touches that let them share basic ideas and emotions. As the evening wound down, Captain Hayes pulled Jake aside. "The ship leaves tomorrow, but we've received new orders from Earth. They want you to stay here as our permanent ambassador to the Kythera." Jake looked over at the three cubs, who were playing near the fire with some wooden toys. "What about my research position on Earth?" "This is your research now," Lisa said with a smile. "You're going to help establish the first permanent human Kythera cooperative colony. Amy has volunteered to stay as well to document everything. And Ben? Ben's going back to file his report and recruit volunteers. Apparently, word about your cubs has already reached the Galactic Council. Everyone wants to understand how this happened." That night, Jake settled into his bed in what would now be his permanent home. As expected, Veltar immediately claimed her spot on his chest, purring contentedly. Kessler curled up beside his left arm while Jorek positioned himself as guardian at the foot of the bed. "This is really happening," Jake murmured to himself. "I'm living with alien cubs who think I'm their family." Veltar looked up at him with her large, bright eyes and made a soft, questioning chirp. Jake gently scratched behind her small horns, a spot he'd learned she particularly enjoyed. "Yes, I'm staying," he told her. "We're family now." The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors. Kythera families from other settlements had traveled all night to see the human who bonded with cubs. Each group brought their own young ones, curious to see if the phenomenon could be repeated. Most of the visiting cubs remained cautious, staying close to their parents as evolutionary programming dictated. But a few showed signs of curiosity, approaching closer than they should have and watching Jake with intense interest. "It's not universal," Jake explained to Amy as they observed the interactions. "But some cubs are naturally more curious and bold. Those are the ones who might form bonds with humans. So we're not looking at all Kyther cubs accepting humans," Amy noted. "Just specific individuals with the right personality traits." "Which makes sense," Jake agreed. "Even among humans, not everyone bonds easily with animals. Individual personality matters more than species." Elder Zethkar joined them as they watched a particularly brave cub from a visiting family edge closer to Jake. "This one shows promise," he observed. "Her parents brought her here specifically to see if she would react as Veltar did." "What happens if she does?" Jake asked. "Then we will know this is not an isolated incident. We will know that humans and Kythera can truly build a future together." Over the following weeks, Jake's life settled into a new routine. His mornings were spent in formal research sessions, documenting the cubs' behavior and development. Afternoons involved meeting with visiting Kythera families and their young ones. Evenings were for playtime with Veltar, Kessela, and Jorek. The cubs grew rapidly, but their bond with Jake only strengthened. They learned to understand basic human words and gestures, while Jake became fluent in their chirping language. More importantly, they began showing behaviors that had never been seen in Kythera development. They played cooperative games instead of the usual competitive ones. They shared food willingly rather than hoarding it. Most remarkably, they showed concern for creatures smaller and weaker than themselves, protecting insects and small forest animals rather than hunting them. "They're learning empathy from you," Senna observed one evening as she watched Veltar gently move a lost bird back to its nest. "Or maybe they always had it," Jake suggested. "Maybe growing up with a human just lets them express it safely." 3 months after the USS Discovery departed, the first human volunteers arrived to begin the cooperative colony project. Jake met them at the landing site with his 3 cubs, who had grown large enough to reach his waist when standing on their hind legs. Dr. Sarah Park, the team leader, stared in amazement as Veltar greeted the newcomers with friendly chirps and playful bounces. "The reports didn't really capture how remarkable this is." "Wait until you see the new cubs," Jake said with a grin. "We've had 6 more successful bonding events with visiting families. The colony is going to need lots of human volunteers." As they walked back toward the settlement, Veltar trotted beside Jake with her usual spot pressed against his leg. Kessela and Jorek flanked them protectively, but their attention was curious rather than suspicious as they examined the new humans. "They really do think you're family," Dr. Park observed. "We are family," Jake corrected gently. "Species doesn't change that." That evening, as Jake sat on his porch writing his daily report to Earth, all 3 cubs settled into their familiar positions around him. Veltar claimed her spot on his chest, now large enough that her head rested under his chin. Her purring had grown deeper and more resonant as she matured, creating a sound that helped Jake focus on his work. In his report, he wrote, "They said predator cubs don't trust humans. Tonight, 3 of them are sleeping on my chest, and tomorrow we begin building a bridge between worlds. What we've learned here isn't just about Kythera and humans. It's about the power of empathy to overcome millions of years of evolutionary programming. When we approach other species with genuine care instead of suspicion, we create possibilities that didn't exist before." He paused in his writing to look down at Veltar, whose breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep. Her small claws were partially extended, gently gripping his shirt.